Jordan Miles, 12 years old. Small for his age, with wide, fearful eyes that darted around the room, searching for reassurance. But there was none. Not here. His fingers twitched at his sides before he slowly raised one trembling hand. And then, with a quiet inhale, he pointed. Straight at Lieutenant Evan Grayson. Gasps rippled through the crowd like a shockwave. The decorated officer sat at the defense table, his face frozen, his grip tightening on the table's edge. Whispers filled the room, disbelief and curiosity colliding in a chaotic murmur. The judge's gavel slammed down. Order! Order in the court! But even as silence was forced upon them, the weight of what had just happened lingered in the air. Grayson's jaw tensed, his usual confidence slipping away as he met the boy's gaze. Jordan's lips parted, his voice barely above a whisper, but sharp enough to cut through the tension like a blade. "That's him," he said. The room shifted. Lawyers exchanged stunned glances, reporters scribbled furiously in their notepads, and somewhere in the front row, Jordan's mother clutched the armrest of her chair so tightly her knuckles turned white. Grayson's expression darkened. "This is ridiculous," he muttered under his breath. But Jordan didn't waver. His small frame might have been shaking, but his resolve was unbreakable. He knew what he had seen. He knew the truth. And now, so did everyone else in that room. The judge adjusted her glasses, studying the boy carefully. "Mr. Miles, you understand the gravity of your accusation?" Jordan swallowed hard. His voice wavered, but he nodded. "Yes, Your Honor." The defense attorney shot to his feet. "Your Honor, I object." Overruled. The judge's voice was firm. "Let the witness continue." Grayson exhaled sharply, his fingers twitching as if itching to grab something. Control, maybe, or the power he once had before this moment. Jordan's chest rose and fell quickly, his heart hammering inside him. He could feel the weight of the room pressing down, 1,000 unspoken questions, demanding answers. How did a 12-year-old boy bring down a man like Evan Grayson? How did he get here? Jordan's gaze flickered to the courtroom doors, as if staring at them could somehow rewind time, pull him back to where it all started. 6 months ago. Before the trial. Before the fear. Before he ever realized that monsters didn't just exist in stories. The afternoon sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the cracked pavement as Jordan Miles walked home from school. His backpack bounced lightly against his shoulders, his sneakers scuffing against the sidewalk with every step. He should have been on the bus. That was the rule. But he'd missed it by a few minutes, and now he had no choice but to walk the long way home. His mother wouldn't be happy about it. She always said their neighborhood wasn't the safest. Jordan wasn't sure if she meant the people or the things that happened when no one was watching. Still, it wasn't all bad. The cool breeze carried the scent of fresh bread from the bakery on the corner, and for a moment, everything felt normal. Peaceful, even. Then he heard it. A sound so faint he almost missed it. A groan, weak and pained, coming from somewhere nearby. Jordan froze. His pulse quickened as he scanned his surroundings. The street was mostly empty, except for a few parked cars lining the curb. He took a cautious step forward, tilting his head to listen. There it was again. This time his eyes locked onto an old sedan tucked behind the convenience store, its rusted exterior barely visible from the main road. Something about it felt wrong, like it didn't belong. His mother's voice echoed in his mind. If something doesn't feel right, walk away. But something about the sound, about the sheer desperation in it, made his feet move before he could think twice. He approached the car, heart hammering against his ribs. The driver's side door was slightly open, the hinges creaking as a faint gust of wind rocked it back and forth. Carefully, Jordan peeked inside. His breath caught. A man was slumped in the back seat, his face swollen and bloodied, his lip split open. His clothes were torn, his chest rising and falling in uneven, shaky breaths. Jordan's instinct screamed at him to run, but his feet stayed rooted to the ground. The man's eyelids fluttered. Then, with great effort, he turned his head toward Jordan. "Please," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "Don't tell anyone." Jordan's stomach twisted. He wanted to ask what happened. Who did this to him? But before he could open his mouth. Headlights. A car pulled into the alleyway, its beams slicing through the dimming evening light. Jordan ducked down, pressing himself against the side of the car, his breathing shallow. The man in the back seat stiffened, panic flashing across his battered face. The vehicle came to a stop just a few feet away. Jordan risked a glance through the small crack in the car door. And that's when he saw him. Lieutenant Evan Grayson. His crisp uniform barely creased, his badge gleaming under the fading sunlight. But his face, his expression, was nothing like the man Jordan had seen shaking hands with neighbors at community meetings. Grayson wasn't here to protect anyone. Jordan watched as the officer yanked another man from the back seat of his own car, shoving him against the alley wall with brutal force. "You know the deal," Grayson said, his voice cold, his grip tightening around the man's collar. "I don't like loose ends." The man struggled, but Grayson only pushed harder, leaning in so close that Jordan could almost hear the threat in his low, even tone. Jordan's fingers curled into fists, his entire body locked in place. Then, Grayson's gaze shifted. Jordan's breath hitched. Had he been seen? He didn't wait to find out. Without thinking, he bolted. His sneakers pounded against the pavement as he ran, his backpack slamming against his back. He didn't stop, didn't turn around. His only thought was, get home. Get home now. By the time he reached his front door, his lungs burned, his hands shook. But even as he slammed the door shut behind him, even as he leaned against it, gasping for air, he knew. This wasn't something he could just forget. Because the look on Grayson's face, the sheer weight of what he had just witnessed, Jordan had just seen something he was never supposed to see. Jordan lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, his heart still racing long after his legs had stopped. The room was quiet, but his mind wasn't. It played the scene over and over. The battered man in the car, Grayson's voice, the way he shoved that other guy against the wall like it was nothing. "I don't like loose ends." Jordan turned onto his side, pressing his face into his pillow, but it didn't help. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Grayson's face. Cold, unshaken, like he'd done this before. He thought about telling his mom. She'd listen. She always did. But what could she do? She wasn't the police. Grayson was. And that scared him more than anything. The red numbers on his alarm clock glowed in the darkness. 3:47 a.m. Sleep wasn't coming. Not tonight. By morning, Jordan felt like a ghost in his own body. His limbs were heavy, his eyes burned from exhaustion, but the unease curling in his stomach wouldn't let him rest. His mother, Tasha Miles, sat across from him at the kitchen table, sipping her coffee and scrolling through her phone. "You look tired," she said, without looking up. Jordan pushed his cereal around in his bowl. "Didn't sleep much." Tasha glanced at him then, her brows furrowing. "You feel sick?" Jordan hesitated. "Number just thinking." She studied him for a second longer, then shrugged. "Well, don't think too hard, baby. School's in an hour." Jordan nodded absently, but his thoughts were elsewhere. Then, the doorbell rang. Something about the sound sent a chill down his spine. A cold, creeping feeling settled in his chest. Tasha set her coffee down and rose from her seat. "Who's showing up this early?" she muttered, making her way to the door. Jordan didn't move. He couldn't. The second his mother pulled the door open, the pit in his stomach grew deeper. Lieutenant Evan Grayson stood on their front porch, hands tucked casually into his pockets, a polite smile on his face. "Morning, ma'am," he said smoothly. "Sorry to drop by unannounced." Tasha raised a brow. "Lieutenant Grayson, didn't expect to see you here." Jordan's grip on his spoon tightened. Grayson's gaze flicked briefly past Tasha, landing on him. The polite smile never wavered, but Jordan caught it. The slight shift in his eyes. A knowing look. A warning. "I just wanted to check in," Grayson continued, turning his attention back to Tasha. "We've had reports of some trouble near the neighborhood. Thought I'd make sure you and your boy were safe." Tasha leaned against the doorframe, crossing her arms. "Appreciate it, but we're fine." Grayson nodded, letting the silence stretch just a second too long before he spoke again. "That's good. Last night, a few folks mentioned seeing a kid running down the street. Looked real shaken up. Sounded an awful lot like Jordan." Tasha turned slightly, giving Jordan a questioning look. Jordan felt his pulse quicken. Grayson tilted his head, feigning curiosity. "You didn't see anything strange last night, did you, kid?" Jordan swallowed hard. He could feel his mother watching him, waiting for an answer. He wanted to tell the truth. He should tell the truth. But the way Grayson was looking at him, calm, almost amused, told him exactly what would happen if he did. Jordan forced himself to shake his head. "No, sir." Grayson held his gaze for a second longer, like he was testing him, waiting for a crack, but Jordan didn't give him one. Finally, Grayson exhaled, slow and measured. "That's good to hear," he said, stepping back onto the porch. "Kids should be careful around here. You never know what kind of trouble you might find if you start sticking your nose where it doesn't belong." The words were smooth, casual, but Jordan understood the message loud and clear. Grayson gave a small nod to Tasha. "You take care now, ma'am." Tasha offered him a stiff smile before closing the door. She turned to Jordan immediately. "Okay," she said, hands on her hips. "What was that about?" Jordan forced a shrug. "I don't know." Tasha studied him, her lips pressing together. She didn't believe him, not completely, but she let it go. "All right," she sighed. "Finish your cereal. You're going to be late." Jordan nodded, but food was the last thing on his mind. Because Grayson wasn't just watching him now, he was warning him. Jordan sat on the front steps of his school, tapping his fingers anxiously against his knee. The morning had dragged on, every class blurring together, his thoughts consumed by one thing, Grayson's warning. He needed to tell someone who would believe him. As students poured out of the school, laughing and shoving each other, Jordan spotted Eric Daniels, his best friend since second grade. Eric was taller, a little louder, always cracking jokes at the worst times. But right now, Jordan needed him. "Eric," Jordan called, pushing through the crowd. Eric turned, adjusting his backpack. "Yo, what's up?" Jordan hesitated, glancing around. "We need to talk." Eric frowned. "Okay." Weird tone. "What's going on?" Jordan exhaled sharply. "Not here. Walk with me." They cut through the school parking lot, heading toward the basketball court, which was mostly empty after school. Jordan didn't waste time. "I saw something, man. Something bad." Eric raised a brow. "Define bad." Jordan's stomach twisted. "I saw Grayson, Lieutenant Grayson, doing something. He hurt someone." Eric snorted. "Nah, Grayson. That dude's like a celebrity cop. They put him on the news, man. He's the good guy." Jordan's jaw clenched. "I saw him, Eric. He was in an alley, roughing some guy up. There was another guy, too, in a car, beaten up real bad. And when I ran, Grayson showed up at my house the next morning." Eric's smirk faded. "Wait, what?" Jordan nodded. He was asking my mom questions, but he wasn't really asking. He was making sure I knew to keep my mouth shut. Eric rubbed his face, clearly uncomfortable. All right, so what do you want to do? Jordan pulled out his phone. We look for the guy, the one in the car. I don't know his name, but there's got to be something online about a missing person. Eric sighed, but pulled out his own phone. This is a terrible idea. Just search. For the next few minutes, they scrolled through missing persons reports, scanning names, faces. Then, here, Eric muttered, holding up his screen. Jordan leaned in. Andre Vasquez, security guard, reported missing 2 weeks ago. Last seen near the same alley. Jordan's throat went dry. That's him. Eric swore under his breath. Okay, that's creepy. Jordan locked eyes with him. I need to go back. Eric's face twisted in disbelief. Number, absolutely not. You're not going back to that alley. I have to, Jordan insisted. What if there's evidence? If we can prove Grayson's involved? Eric threw his hands up. Dude, you're 12. You are not an undercover detective. Jordan's stomach churned. Eric, that man is gone. And if Grayson did something to him, he's gonna keep doing it. I can't just sit here and pretend I didn't see anything. Eric sighed, dragging a hand down his face. I hate you for making sense right now. The alley looked the same as before. Dark, quiet, forgotten. Jordan stepped carefully over broken glass, his heart hammering. Eric followed a few steps behind, mumbling, I can't believe I let you talk me into this. The car was still there, parked at an odd angle, as if someone had left in a hurry. Jordan swallowed and crept closer, pulling his phone out. He peered inside. No sign of Andre. The back seat was empty, but his breath caught. Blood. Dark stains smeared across the worn fabric. Eric cursed under his breath. Dude. Jordan reached for the handle. The door creaked open slightly, revealing something crumpled on the floor. A badge. He picked it up carefully. It was cracked, half torn, but the name was still visible. Andre Vasquez. Jordan quickly snapped a photo of the badge, then another of the blood-stained seat. That's enough, Eric hissed. We got proof. Let's go. Before Jordan could move, a rough voice sounded from behind them. You shouldn't be here. Both boys spun around, hearts leaping to their throats. An old man stood a few feet away, wrapped in layers of ragged clothing. His eyes, sharp and knowing, flicked between them and the car. Jordan swallowed. Do you know what happened here? The man's lips pressed into a thin line. I know who that car belonged to, and I know who runs this area. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. Grayson. Jordan's breath caught. You mean, boy, listen to me. The man's gaze darkened. People who cross him? They disappear. Jordan and Eric exchanged nervous glances. Then, somewhere in the distance, the unmistakable sound of a car door slamming. The message was clear. Time to go. The house was quiet. Too quiet. Jordan sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the glow of his phone screen, scrolling through the photos he'd taken in the alley. Andre's badge, the blood-stained seat, the proof that something terrible had happened. He should have felt relieved, but all he felt was dread. The words of the old man echoed in his head. People who cross him disappear. A shiver ran down his spine. He wasn't imagining things. Grayson was dangerous, and Jordan had just put himself right in his sights. He tossed his phone onto the nightstand and leaned back against his pillow, exhaling. Maybe he was just being paranoid. Maybe everything was fine. Then he noticed it. The window. It was open, not wide open, just an inch, barely enough to be noticed. But Jordan knew he had locked it. His breath hitched. Slowly, he sat up, his pulse hammering in his ears. He approached the window cautiously, peering through the glass. The street outside was dim, lit only by flickering streetlights. Then, as if on cue, His phone buzzed. Jordan nearly jumped out of his skin. He spun around, snatching the phone off his nightstand. Unknown number. His fingers trembled as he opened the message. "Stay out of this." The air in the room seemed to thicken. His throat went dry. Someone had been in his room. Someone had unlocked that window. His stomach twisted as he slowly turned back toward the glass, dread settling like a heavy stone in his chest. And that's when he saw it. A car. Parked across the street. Headlights off. Inside, barely visible through the dim glow of the dashboard, Grayson. Sitting there, watching. Jordan's breath came in shallow gasps. Number no, no, no. His entire body screamed at him to move, to hide, to do something. Instead, he stepped closer. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then, Grayson tilted his head, just slightly. A smirk. Jordan's chest tightened, his hands clenched into fists. He had two choices. He could pretend he hadn't seen him. Act normal. Maybe Grayson would leave. Or... Jordan bolted. He turned so fast his foot nearly slipped on the hardwood, but he caught himself and sprinted out of his room, flying down the hallway toward the stairs. His mother's voice called from the living room. "Jordan?" He ignored her. He reached the front door, his fingers fumbling at the lock. He needed to make sure it was secure. Needed to... Click. The unmistakable sound of a car door opening. Jordan's breath caught. Grayson was getting out. Jordan stumbled backward, panic roaring through his veins. He turned and ran toward the kitchen, his mind racing. His mom. He had to tell her. Had to. Another buzz. His phone, still clenched in his shaking hand. A second message. "Don't make this harder on yourself." Jordan barely stopped himself from throwing the phone across the room. This wasn't a warning anymore. It was a promise. Jordan knew one thing for certain. He couldn't do this alone. Grayson wasn't just some neighborhood bully he could avoid until things blew over. He was a cop, a powerful one. And if the texts, the open window, and the way he sat outside Jordan's house weren't enough proof, then nothing was. He needed help. But not just from anyone. Someone who could actually do something. That's how he found himself standing outside a small, run-down precinct on the other side of town, gripping his backpack strap so tight his fingers ached. Detective Olivia Carter. He'd heard her name before. His mom had mentioned her once, in one of those hushed, grown-up conversations she didn't think he was listening to. Carter had a reputation. She didn't play favorites, didn't back down, and most importantly, there were rumors, whispers, that she'd been looking into corrupt cops, people like Grayson. Jordan took a deep breath and stepped inside. The station was quieter than he expected, the hum of a coffee machine filling the air as tired officers moved through the space. No one paid him much attention as he walked toward the back, scanning the nameplates until... Carter. He hesitated for only a second before knocking. A voice called from inside. "Doors open." Jordan pushed it open and stepped in. Detective Olivia Carter sat behind her cluttered desk, rubbing her temples like she had the weight of the world on her shoulders. She looked up, her sharp eyes narrowing at the sight of him. "You lost, kid?" Jordan swallowed hard. "I need to talk to you." Carter leaned back in her chair, arms crossing. "I'm off duty, and unless you're reporting a stolen bike, I'm not interested." Jordan didn't move. He reached into his backpack, pulled out his phone, and placed it on her desk. She sighed. "What's this?" "Proof," Jordan said quietly. Something in his tone made Carter pause. She glanced at him, then at the screen. Her expression didn't change as she flipped through the pictures. The blood-stained seat. The badge with Andre's name. The car, abandoned like a crime scene no one bothered to clean up. Carter's fingers stilled over the last image. When she spoke again, her voice had lost its edge. "Where did you get these?" "I was there," Jordan admitted. "I saw Grayson. He did something to a guy in an alley. I don't know what, but it was bad." Carter's jaw tightened. "You shouldn't be looking into this." Jordan's frustration boiled over. "I didn't want to. But I saw it, and now Grayson knows I saw it. That got her attention. She leaned forward, scanning his face like she was trying to piece something together. He's threatened you. Jordan hesitated. Not directly, but he's watching me. He texted me from an unknown number. My window was open last night, and I know I locked it. Carter exhaled slowly. This is bad. Jordan's hands clenched into fists. I know. For a long moment, Carter didn't say anything. She just looked at him, like she was weighing something in her head. Then she reached for her desk drawer, pulled out a folder, and slid it toward him. Jordan blinked. What's this? She tapped the cover. Andre Vasquez. His stomach dropped. You already knew about him? Carter nodded. I've been investigating him for months. He was a security guard for a company that had a contract with the city. He reported something, filed an official complaint against Grayson and some other officers. Jordan's heart pounded. What kind of complaint? That's the problem. Carter sighed. The report disappeared before I could get my hands on it. And then, so did Andre. Jordan's pulse hammered. You think Grayson? I know Grayson's involved. She looked at him, her expression grim. But this goes higher than just him. A chill ran down Jordan's spine. What do you mean? Carter hesitated, then lowered her voice. Grayson isn't acting alone. If we pull this thread, we might unravel something a lot bigger. Jordan swallowed hard. He wasn't sure what terrified him more, that Grayson wasn't working alone, or that, whatever was going on, he was already in too deep to turn back. Jordan's hands were sweaty as he gripped his phone, his heart hammering in his chest. This is a bad idea, he muttered. Across from him, Detective Carter leaned against the hood of her unmarked car, arms crossed. You got a better one? Jordan didn't. The plan was simple, too simple. They would make Grayson think Jordan was alone, wandering near the same alley where everything started. If he took the bait, if he came after Jordan again, Carter and her team would be waiting. It should have reassured him, knowing backup was there. But as Jordan stared down the empty street, the flickering streetlight casting long shadows along the brick walls, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking straight into a nightmare. Carter placed a firm hand on his shoulder. Stay close to the wall. Keep your phone in your pocket. Audio recording. We need him to talk, got it? Jordan nodded. Got it. Carter gave him a final look. If anything feels wrong, say the word, and we pull you out. Jordan swallowed the lump in his throat, then turned and started walking. Each step felt heavier than the last. The alley loomed ahead, dark and silent. Jordan forced himself to keep moving, his ears straining for any sound, any sign that Grayson was watching. He didn't have to wait long. A sharp crunch echoed behind him. Jordan stiffened, stopping just short of the alley entrance. His breath hitched as a slow, deliberate voice cut through the quiet. You just don't know when to quit, do you, kid? Jordan turned slowly. Grayson stood a few feet away, hands in his pockets, his expression unreadable. But his eyes were dark, filled with something cold and unshaken. Jordan forced himself to stand his ground. You're scared. Grayson let out a low chuckle. You don't understand how this works, do you? He took a step closer, and Jordan's pulse spiked. People like me don't get caught. You think Carter's gonna save you? She's got nothing. Jordan's fingers brushed the phone in his pocket, the recording still going. I have proof, he said. Grayson's smirk faded. A long, tense silence stretched between them. Then, slowly, he exhaled, shaking his head like he was disappointed. You know, Grayson murmured, reaching for something under his jacket. I really hoped you'd just let this go. Jordan's stomach twisted. Gun. Before Grayson could fully draw it. Freeze, hands in the air. Red and blue lights flooded the alley as Carter's voice rang out, sharp and commanding. Grayson's expression flickered with something, annoyance maybe, but not fear. He didn't even flinch as he raised his hands, letting officers swarm around him, their weapons trained on him. Carter moved in first, grabbing his arm and yanking him forward. "Evan Grayson, you're under arrest for—" Grayson turned his head, locking eyes with Jordan, and then, as the cuffs clicked around his wrists, he smiled. Not an angry smile, not a defeated one, a knowing one. He leaned in just enough for only Jordan to hear. "This isn't over, kid." Jordan's stomach turned, but he didn't look away, because deep down, he knew Grayson was right. Jordan sat in the dimly lit office of the precinct, his knee bouncing as he gripped a styrofoam cup of untouched hot chocolate. Across the desk, Detective Carter flipped through a thick folder, her expression unreadable. Grayson was in custody. That should have been the end of it. But it wasn't. Carter exhaled, tapping a finger against a document before sliding it toward Jordan. He hesitated before leaning in. It was a report. Dozens of names, transactions, case files. Grayson wasn't working alone, Carter said, her voice heavy. He was protecting someone, multiple someones. Jordan's stomach tightened. "Who?" Carter sat back in her chair, running a hand down her face. "Higher-ups, not just cops, judges, city officials. This thing runs deep." Jordan swallowed hard. "So what happens now?" Carter's lips pressed into a thin line. "Now, we dig." Just then, a knock on the door. An officer poked his head in. "They found him." Jordan shot to his feet. "Who?" Carter didn't answer. She just grabbed her coat. "Come on, kid. You need to see this." The hospital room smelled like antiseptic and stale air. Machines beeped softly in the background, and in the middle of it all, lying motionless in the bed, was Andre Vasquez. He looked worse than before, face swollen, arm wrapped in bandages, an IV taped to his wrist. But he was alive. Jordan barely breathed as he stepped closer. Andre's eyelids fluttered, then slowly opened. His gaze, clouded with exhaustion, landed on Carter first, then shifted to Jordan. For a moment, he just stared. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, "You're the kid." Jordan nodded, unsure of what to say. Andre swallowed painfully. "You shouldn't have gotten involved." Jordan's hands clenched at his sides. "I had to." Andre's tired eyes flickered with something between gratitude and regret. Carter spoke up. "Andre, we need to know, who else was involved?" A long silence. Then, with a shaky breath, Andre rasped, "It's bigger than Grayson." Carter and Jordan exchanged a glance. They already knew that. But the way Andre said it, like he was scared, sent a fresh wave of unease through Jordan's chest. Andre exhaled, closing his eyes. They don't stop. The weight of those words settled deep in Jordan's bones. 2 weeks later, the courtroom was packed. Cameras flashed, reporters whispered, and in the middle of it all, Jordan sat on the witness stand, palms sweating as he faced the crowd. He should have been nervous. Maybe he was. But when his eyes landed on Grayson, sitting at the defense table in his crisp orange jumpsuit, something steadied inside him. The judge cleared her throat. "Jordan Miles, please recount what you witnessed on the night of—" Jordan took a deep breath. And he spoke. Told them everything. About the alley, about Andre, about the threats, the texts, the open window, about how a 12-year-old had been hunted because he saw something he was never supposed to see. He expected Grayson to look angry, maybe even guilty. But he didn't. He just sat there, watching. Like he knew something no one else did. Like this wasn't the end. That night, Jordan sat on his bed, staring out the window. The street below was quiet. Still. Then, in the distance, headlights. A black car parked just far enough away to be inconspicuous. Jordan's fingers curled around the curtain. They were still watching. This wasn't over. Not even close. Jordan took a slow breath, his fingers still gripping the curtain as he stared at the car in the distance. He wasn't naive enough to think this was finished. Grayson might be behind bars, but the people he worked for, the ones pulling the strings, were still out there. This was bigger than him, bigger than one corrupt cop. But that didn't mean he was going to stop. Because the truth, it mattered. And if no one else was willing to stand up, then maybe it had to start with him. Corruption thrives in silence. But silence isn't an option. If you see something, say something, stand up, speak out. Because the fight for justice isn't just in the hands of those in power, it's in yours, too.